One of the things that disabled people would have participated in are pilgrimages, and here's a nice example from something called the Luttrell Psalter, which is a very famous book kept in the British Library. It's made in the early 14th century, so 1320s, 1330s, something like that. And it shows a group of pilgrims, that's these three figures here, approaching Mont Saint-Michel, that's in France, but the assumption is that people from England may have travelled to France. Certainly people within England travelled. You only have to think of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the pilgrims going to Canterbury in the shrine of Thomas Becket. Now, this picture actually shows some of the mobility aids that would have been around. You can probably recognise the crutches. So there's a man who's mobility impaired and he's walking on two crutches, and behind him is a person with just a single staff. I think that person would have been blind. They would have used the staff, not the white coloured cane, but just to help guide themselves along. Now, this might be a bit more unsettling for modern viewers, but the person at the end who's kneeling, he's got what look like little tables or little trestles under his hands. So they're flat platforms with a couple of inches of wood underneath to help support the hands. Now this person would have been so mobility impaired that they couldn't walk on crutches anymore, and their way of moving around is basically crawling on their legs, on their knees, and using their hands with these handheld wooden devices to pull themselves forwards. Now, this doesn't have to sound shocking. It's obviously something you don't want to see today, but for the time there was nothing bad about it. There's nothing about seeing this person as anything less of an individual. It's just that 600-700 years ago, when you rarely had access to the kind of technology we take for granted, if that's the only way someone like this could move around, then that's what they did. And they're depicted quite often, these kind of hand things, and you find them all over Europe. And also they're cheap to make, so anybody, even an impoverished person, even a beggar, could have afforded these. But the whole point is that this group of people are going on pilgrimage. Now, people went in groups, so more often than not they would have been able-bodied people who were going on pilgrimage for completely different reasons, maybe to fulfil a vow, or maybe to kind of make good for something that they'd done wrong. But they would have been mixed groups. You don't have just disabled people in a single group. You would have had people of all abilities travelling together. So there will have been people to help along. And on the route, I mean, people sometimes travelled for days, sometimes for weeks. There are records of mobility impaired people, like this man here on the hand trestles, travelling for a couple of weeks in this slow crawling motion, sometimes being helped by people en route to get to a shrine. But while they're doing the pilgrimage, they have the special status of pilgrim, which again means that people will help them. People will give them alms, so that means people will give them food, money, provide shelter. They can stay in hospitals if there are some en route. The hospital would be more like a hostel rather than a place for sick people. And the whole point is that by taking this journey on themselves, that's already part of the healing process. It's a spiritual journey as well as a physical journey. So the church would encourage this, because this whole idea that by going through the journey and the hardships involved, again, it's meant to cleanse the soul, which makes it much more likely, once they get to the shrine, they might find favour and find a cure. Now, again, this is something that with our modern, rational, kind of sceptical mind, we find quite difficult to believe. So in some ways, the stories of medieval miracles are probably best used for the descriptions of what kind of people went, because they tell us an awful lot about the kinds of disabilities people had, and perhaps we need to take with a pinch of salt the stories of the healing. But certainly in terms of how people travelled, how they were supported, we can use these miracle stories as very valuable sources.